So we've known each other for quite a few years. We've worked together quite a few times actually across commercial and a couple of fun little projects.
Yeah,
You are best known for, is it fair to say,
don't
being
know
a part
about
of
that.
Monteberry and releasing Banners of Ruin on Steam. Do you call yourself a game developer?
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, you wear lots of hats, but that's fundamentally what I
Yeah.
am.
And one of a two-person team, you and Alec Thomas,
Yeah,
who put out Banners of Ruin. You as the develop lead, him as the art lead.
technical lead, creative lead is
Yeah.
probably how we separate it. Yeah.
Okay. So we're probably going to end up today talking about banners in a few different ways. So let's just lay a foundation here. What is Banners of Ruin?
Bands of Ruin is a party-based deck builder set in a world of medieval animals. I have had to say
Yeah,
that
this
sentence
feels
quite a few
you're ready
times.
for that one.
Yeah. So effectively, you control a group of up to 6 characters. It can be from 1 to 6 through a city. It takes place across 3 streets, which are like different stages of the game. You can recruit new characters as you go, and you switch between having to deal with story-based encounters, which we call scenarios, and combat, where you're playing from a hand of cards.
Yeah.
And it's become a fairly established kind of genre, the deck builder.
So the scenarios being a kind of lower pressure, you just make a decision, and the combat being a much more kind of tactical.
Yeah, combat's highly strategic. You've got to deal with some level of randomness by
Yeah.
virtue of what your hand sort of contains at any given time. Whereas the scenarios are more structured; they're always the same, with some small levels of variation. But they're where you kind of make small modifications to your party and things like that.
And it's that evolving deck that makes it a deck builder, right? You're bringing new cards in and removing cards. And
Yeah.
it's a little bit like for anyone who hadn't played it, if you were playing poker and as you went along, you introduced more aces to the deck, it would change the distribution of what was likely to be drawn and therefore how you kind of bet, oh,
Yeah.
I think it's more likely something will or won't come up. And you've done that in lots of interesting ways. But that does mean that when you're designing a game, you've had to kind of decide what those cards can and can't do, and then presumably generate or author quite a large array of content. You've had to do lots of cards so that users have something to interact with.
Yeah, I can't remember how many, but there's hundreds now of cards and what we call passives, which are effects that characters can have, which are just always present. And for instance, if you play 3 cards in a hand, maybe some status effect gets added to a character, which is beneficial.
And I suppose the interest there for a player would be that compounding of like how these cards interact with each other.
Yeah, the kind of gameplay of interest comes out from the emergent, as we would say, design quality. So how, in kind of surprising ways, different cards and effects can interact with one another.
Okay. So the name of the podcast is Lost Pixels. So that covers a few different things, but one of them is things that either never made it into a game or a production, maybe never should have made it into a game.
Yeah.
The kind of stories of the behind the scenes, giving people an idea of the bit that they never saw. So people never saw you design and make this game. It's gone on to be quite successful. You have a good following. It's sold reasonably well, and it's been, by my definition, a success.
Yeah, we're able to go on and do further work, so that's my definition.
That's
success,
definitely
yeah.
a win. But it maybe wouldn't always have become that. There were probably other things it might have been. We were talking a bit earlier, and you mentioned that there was not necessarily a version of the game, but a direction that the game could have gone in.
Yeah,
it was quite different.
It wasn't going to be a deck builder to begin with at first. So our main inspiration going into Banners was a game called Battle Brothers, which similarly you control a party of mercenaries, which grows over the course of the game, and you roam a map and you take on different contracts where you're going to take on different combat. So it might be like a noble faction has gone rogue, or there could be some orcs that have invaded a town, or there's an undead uprising, and that game ends with like a different kind of catastrophe event where it could be an undead uprising or noble war. And we were quite inspired by that game. There's a lot of things I like about Battle Brothers. So we were thinking,
so it sounds very story based. There's a lot of narrative there.
Not you have story encounters in it, but
Okay.
they're not really the focus. It's much more about it's a hex based kind of squad based, turn based, to use lots of based words, combat game really. So most of the actual meat and potatoes of the game is in your mercenaries fighting with other groups.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so that was our main inspiration. And so initially, Banners was going to be similar, where you had a party of mercenaries you'd accrue, and you would roam a map and you take on different contracts. And it was going to explore more of the world. Whereas what ended up happening is we were like, well, we can't actually afford to make a game of this scope. It was too big, and so we needed to constrain it. So we decided, well, instead of a map, it's going to be one city, and there were story reasons that made sense for that to happen, and so you were going to infiltrate this enemy city, and then I'd been playing a lot of Dominion. We played a lot of Dominion from various friends, which is a what would be called a Euro game, I guess, but it's like it's a German, I believe, deck builder. I think it's the first standalone deck builder that was created. So
Right.
deck builders have their origins, I think, in Magic: The Gathering, where there was a particular kind of game mode that players invented where they decided, oh, it'd be interesting if we like accrue different cards over the course of a single game, and it was like a kind of player mod of that
Right.
game.
Okay. I didn't know that.
I think so. I'm not too
Sure.
jammed up on that. Whereas Dominion was the first. It's a board game, the first game which came along with that as an established format.
Yeah.
So I played a lot of Dominion. I really, really like Dominion. Something I like about deck builders generally is that you have this kind of combinatorial explosion of mechanics. You notice things about each individual card differently when they're paired with different cards.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of like more than the sum of its parts kind of feel to deck builders, which I like.
And they're very, certainly when we play Dominion, it's very tactical. It's interesting that you can see the lay of the land at the beginning and you can understand these are the constraints of the game, these are the cards that are available to me. It's unique. So each time you play it because of the way that the cards combine with each other, any two of the three cards that are available, for example, there's really articulated that very well, but you pick 10 cards out of something like 20 in the base game, but it's out of like 60 or 100, depending on how many expansions you have. That combination of 10 cards you may have never played before. It's more than likely you've never played before.
Yeah. I think the tagline is there's more combinations of Dominion than there are stars in the skies. I have no idea if the math
It
adds
feels
up.
like it when you play it.
Yeah, for sure.
And so you get to look at that and say, okay, well, with this new thing that's been presented to me, I get to be tactical and make decisions how I'm going to strategize as the game unfolds. And then you mentioned RNG in your game, which is always a big topic. Because of the way that you draw a card out of a deck and you don't know what the next card is going to be, there's always an element of you are trying to control the random and constrain it by building out a deck.
Yes.
But there's always an element of I don't actually know what's going to happen next. It's a little bit like a slot machine.
From turn to turn, you're not sure what you're going to have to work with. So every turn is going to play differently. But as you said, you try and mitigate the randomness. So one way typically people do that in deck builders is you just reduce the number of cards in your deck so that you're more likely to draw high quality cards. So in a weird way, in a game, generally with games, when you get new things, that's a good thing. In a deck builder, you have to be very careful about taking on a new card because you're adding something that's always going to come with you and there's a chance to draw it. So if it's a low quality card, you're actually hampering your ability.
I find not to go too on a tangent, but when I talk to people and try to teach them Dominion, the concept that you wouldn't want cards is often very difficult for them to gather until they've played it.
It's very unintuitive,
Yeah.
Thinning your deck is the phrase that would be used, and that's a weird concept for people to get on board with.
So Banners became a deck builder out of your, where you were in life and what you were playing and what you were engaging with, which I think is quite a typical story. I think people often make the game that they're playing or make a version of the game that they're playing. So it's nice that you were able to amalgamate a couple of different aspects and to create something more unique. So you had to approach this as a relatively young developer at the time. I mean, in industry for a couple of years.
Yeah. Depending on how you want to count industry experience,
Sure.
There was some I was doing alongside uni, probably 3 years, maybe, let's say, of relevant experience. And I don't know how old I was, but probably 21, 22, I think.
And you came at this thing when I've been playing a lot of it. I reckon I can work out how to design the game and the tools and the content.
Yeah.
So you came in that very naively, relatively speaking.
Very naively.
Where did that path lead you? Where did you start, I suppose, is the interesting thing. How did you first look at the problem and say, this is how I think I should deal with this?
Yeah, it's interesting to try and chart my mind back there. I think we worked on some projects before where it was to do with spell casting. And so, that was the most recent sort of gameplay project I'd jumped off, I think. And when you approach deck builders, the first thing you're kind of thinking about is, well, cards can do a whole variety of things. So this system has to be very flexible, but also every card has to interact properly with every other card because you cannot test every combination of cards because you can't just go from does card A work with card B? It has to be does card A work with card B in the set of cards C, D, E? Like all of those things can interact in very complex ways. So I think I began approaching it as well. everything is probably going to need to trigger from some kind of gameplay event. So when you play a card or when a character gets a status effect, and
Everyone needs to hear about it. It's that kind
yeah,
of
very
this thing
loud,
happened. Do you
shouty.
want to be
Yeah.
a part
So
of it?
anytime something happens, we shout about it, and then we ask everything else in the game that's present,
Mm.
do you want to respond to that?
And then that naturally evolves into a priority system where you have to then say, well, whose opinion is more important? Is this card triggering more important, or is the enemy's?
Yeah, and naively, your first way of approaching that is probably, well, we resolve all card effects, then we resolve all status effects. Then you might have some order. I'm not saying that's the correct one, but you have some order. But then very quickly you realize, well, no, actually, individual status effects or individual passives need to be ordered differently to other individual. So it becomes a tough problem.
So presumably you have to then, you sort of mentioned that there was initially almost a library of different things that you could do. You could deal damage, you could draw a card, you could discard a card, you could destroy a card to thin your deck. And those were quite concrete blocks of code that you could kind of write, this is damage equals health minus da 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 da, and form a little grab bag of things that were available to you. That seems like the naive approach, not necessarily always the right approach.
Yeah.
But did that does that resonate with how you would have approached it?
Yeah, we had an interesting, speaking to the Lost Pixels kind of philosophy, the way cards are created in the game is now not how I would create them. So it became obvious that, like, okay, a card can respond to all these different things. So it's like on play, it does this thing. Maybe it responds to when another card is played. But because we were a two-man team and it wasn't clear how content was going to be designed and like who would author it, and I thought, oh, well, maybe further into the project when I have more responsibilities than Alec, it would be useful if Alec could help create cards.
Yeah.
And since Alec isn't a programmer, he needed some other means. So I decided, oh, I'll approach that as a visual programming tool, and I'll write a node editor for cards. And that's led to a lot of interesting things. It makes it very easy to kind of package things in my mind of like, okay, this card has this node, which means it's doing that thing. But it's become very cumbersome because Alec's not a programmer. So whilst he did a great job on most of the visual programming he did, he'd always have to send cards back to me and be like, hey, does this work? Does this look appropriate? And I'd have to effectively debug it, fix problems. That added a lot of friction where I then just started making more and more of the cards. And at that point, you start thinking, well, was it right to have approached it with a node editor, given that I don't need the node editor and it's kind of a hindrance on me?
So it sounds like the way that you would approach that is you start by thinking, well, I've got these concepts in my game of damage, draw, discard, and they're quite big, meaty concepts. You make them into a node. And then the next thing you think is, well, we want them to be dynamic to an extent. We want to deal 6 damage under these conditions and 2 damage under those. So you realize that this graph, this visual programming piece of work you've made needs to take in some inputs. It needs to take in the state of the world. And as you think of more and more complex cards, you probably end up thinking of more and more inputs you might need. I might need to know what I've played before or some other part of the world. Do I have this? Do I have that? So you get a lot of logic operators going in there. You get these ifs, and then you have to do comparisons.
It's a lot of operator comparisons and banners.
And it's just logic. And in a line of code, that logic is probably relatively straightforward.
Very concise, yeah.
But in visual scripting, it's not. Was it more than that? I mean, because you talk about this explosion of complexity.
So there's the complexity of having to produce individual cards. And as you say, it's a line of code is very concise in terms of logical operations. But when it's a graph, there's a labor cost of, if I want, where I would normally type greater than, I now have to add a node for operator comparison. I have to select greater than, then I plug it into the node. That's so much. It doesn't sound like a lot, and you could be like, oh, boo-hoo, go do your job. But compared to the experience of just writing text, it's horribly like frictious. But then there's also the cost of, if we were just writing code for how the game works, I just have to write the code. But in a node editor, I have to write the code to be exposed to the node editor.
Yes.
So there's this kind of packaging cost of things have to work for the node graph, which means that the code has to be written a certain way in order to constrain to meet certain constraints. And some of those aren't my own. So it might be we're working in Unity as a game engine, and serialization. There's certain things that I have to sort of work on.
So just to be clear, serialization is sort of the process of taking memory that's in the CPU and in RAM and saving it into the hard drive so it can be recalled later. So you might be able to design a node system on your computer screen, and that's great, and that's all in memory. But if you can't then save it and bring it
Yeah.
back later, you also couldn't then save it and package it into your game.
Exactly, yeah. And unfortunately, Unity imposes certain constraints on
Mm.
what things can be serialized or how they need to be serialized, which
Right.
means that the code necessarily has to be written differently to
Yeah.
what would be the
Yeah.
optimal way of writing it.
So you've got a kind of idea in your head of like, if I didn't use the node editor, this is how this piece of logic would exist, and this is the kind of data it would take in, and in
And it
this
would be
format.
hugely simpler. Yeah.
And it would be a relatively small piece of code, but you've got all these constraints being put on you by virtue of it being Unity and visual scripting that mean you're now not only doing things, well, you're doing them suboptimally. You're doing them in a
Yeah.
way that you wouldn't otherwise have chosen to do them. And then you start looking at the benefits and saying, why did I do this again?
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the main benefits you could argue still is kind of in play is that I could release this tool to the public and it would be
Yeah.
a great modding tool. Not thinking about doing that because there's a lot of kind of additional things which become a problem there in terms of now suddenly you've got a tool out there which people could maybe repurpose when there was a huge amount of work. Maybe I don't want to do that. There's also a lot of the kind of UX experience of using this tool isn't
Yeah.
fantastic. People would
Yeah.
probably complain, and I don't.
You struggle through, Alex struggles
Yeah,
through, but
yeah,
a member of
but
the public might be a bit pissed off if they.
exactly. And
Yeah.
you think, well, I don't really want to spend the time doing that. I'd rather just work on the game.
Yeah.
So there are benefits.
It's worth being clear. The game has shipped with multiple DLCs, and it is still the system that you use to make
It is,
cards, right?
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And something we've also talked about in the past is that not only does it constrain the way in which you sort of program an effect, but I know you've got a lot of thoughts about game design and how it maybe constrains the design space, or how you think about the design space and how you then go on to make the game.
I don't know if the node editor side is related to that. But yeah, certainly I've developed some philosophies of game design over the process of making banners, but the node editor has made things differently. One thing I will say is that you mentioned this is still the established way we do it. I could have decided halfway through, okay, Alex is not really using this. There's not a lot of value.
Yeah.
I'll just start writing cards as code with no graph exposure. I decided that would be a bad idea because I generally think you want code across a game's lifetime to be consistent because it makes it very hard to jump back between things and develop a kind of model in your mind of how something works if your approach for different elements in the game is constructed very differently. So it's not just that cards work this way. It's that cards work that way, status effects work that way, passives work that way, AI behaviors work that way.
Right.
So it goes very deep.
Was that always the plan? Did you always, when you started on the node editor, did you think this is going to work for everything?
Everything in combat, pretty much.
Sure.
So there's maybe two things which don't work that way, which are what are called modifiers in the game. So they're kind of global things that can affect the campaign, the kind of meta game, and the combat. They don't work in the graph system, but the intent was pretty much everything in combat will work this way because if Alec designs a new enemy, he could implement it.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. If we were a team of more than two people and we had designers who didn't code but could use a visual programming tool, it would be the correct choice. But it became apparent for a team of two people, there's more cost invested in the tool than we got out of it.
But you do, and even at the time, you would have been aware that there are other options that allow a not code-based, or certainly not difficult code-based interface for non-coders. So some games look towards things like Lua,
scripting languages, yeah.
Or perhaps these days you might even go more in this direction. You could go with a more data-driven approach, where the designer's job is to tweak numbers and pick options from drop downs and configure things that way.
The data-driven approach is an interesting one for deck builders because every card kind of has its own little mini behavior system that isn't. There's a lot of data associated with cards, but the behavior isn't data-driven. So, for instance, if a card is going to pull a card from your draw pile, which is, you can think of if you had a deck of cards and you draw some, you might end up throughout a game putting them in different piles. A card might want to manipulate a card might want to manipulate where another card is in terms of which pile it's currently in. That's a very different thing to this card should attack. And so in order to represent that purely by data, if you thought of it as a table of like, how many cards should I draw? How many damage should I do? It would be a massive table.
Yeah.
It's not really the right sort of approach to dealing with it. Scripting languages, certainly something that's been used throughout the industry. I think we have now settled on accepting that they're not very good in comparison to something like visual scripting, which is better because most scripting languages are interpreted. So to define that, when you write some kind of programming language, you're either going to write it interpreted, which means the program steps through the lines of code as it goes and it executes them in sequence. And then if it hits a problem, that problem happens at runtime. Whereas if it's a compiled language, that means some program will walk through the lines of code and try and find issues with it ahead of time, and then it won't allow you to kind of ship that if it's got flaws. The latter would be a much better approach for scripting languages, because it means that a designer could write code and evaluate whether this is likely to work. Whereas because there's so much more work, that isn't something that's happened. And so we've ended up with interpreted scripting languages, which means you're liable to encountering a lot of minor errors that are going to add up. And one concrete example I can point to is, I think it's one of the Aliens games, like Alien versus Predator or Alien Colonial Marines. On release, I believe people really thought it was quite poorly made and they weren't happy with some of the AI behaviors. And it's something like 10 years later, a guy on Reddit comes along and says, oh, I've looked into the game's AI scripts and I found there's like a white space character here that shouldn't be here. And he fixes it, and then suddenly all of the AI behavior works so much better. And it's one of these things where it's like, oh, well, that's an unfortunate case of where the designer, their intent was sound, but the tool, it allowed them some error that shouldn't have crept in, and it's harmed the game. So I wouldn't choose to use scripting languages because they feel like a poorer substitute than a compiled programming language. They're also similar enough that you kind of, if you're training someone to use a scripting language, why not just train them to use C#, which is the language that we used for.
It's also about, you are in both cases with visual scripting or a scripting language, you still have to expose an interface to your game. You still have to make that block of logic that says, this is the function through which you deal damage. Here's the parameters that are required as an input. You need to give me this information and I will do the heavy lifting, the logic, the resolution down the line. So I suppose it's kind of comparable in either case. Whereas at least to a higher extent, if somebody is interfacing with the game logic through the sort of native language that the game is programmed in, they're still probably going to have some of those interfaces available to them, but they're also able to access some of the deeper stuff if they know what they're doing and essentially do the same piece of logic that your interface was doing anyway, but maybe slightly differently.
That is,
whether that's a good thing or not.
So that's the thing, that is a useful distinction, because it means that I can sandbox the kind of Fisher Price stuff for Alec, if you like, in terms of these are the things you can play with and nothing should go wrong. Whereas if I expose everything, very radical things could change the game.
I mean, that talks to that's visual scripting in a nutshell, really. And I don't want to get too into the kind of Unreal Unity conflict or code blueprint conflict, but Fisher Price, Duplo, kind of the words I would use around blueprint, because they do that same thing. They kind of swaddle you and they wrap you in. Here's a subset of what is actually available to you. And unfortunately for blueprint artists, it's quite a small subset relative to a wider, native language. But it's safe. It's a playground.
That is a
good
benefit.
For dipping your toes in.
Yeah.
And like you say, with there are scripting languages where you can make mistakes and they cannot be caught even in a shipped game, which is ridiculous. Most visual scripts systems that I've used, at least in terms of things in Blueprint, Playmaker, Bolt, and Unity, they all compile down to native code, which is compiled and which can have errors and which can tell you about the errors at the point of compilation, which as a designer might be a bit annoying. You go, why has everything gone red? And it's like, because you made a mistake and you need to fix it, because that's your job. We can't let this thing through, which is at least I think a good thing. To touch back on the game design side of it, because I sort of said, do you feel like visual scripting constrained you? You want to make a game that is complex and interesting and which can have these combinatorial, possibly even explosions, but certainly that cards can interface with each other. I mentioned things like damage, draw, and discard. Presumably you have quite a few more nouns in your library than that.
Actually, now you've explained it like that, I'm beginning to remember a lot of scenarios where the node editor did pose a constraint. So because of the constraints I mentioned earlier in terms of serialization, that kind of thing, the node editor has to work a certain way. And that immediately constrains you from the freedom of what would be available in the native programming language to the sandbox system I've designed. If everything has to be piped through the sandbox, when you need a new mechanic, you either need to grow the sandbox or you have to find a way of
Yes.
putting the square brick through the circular
Yeah.
hole.
You're almost hacking your own game.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that does become uncomfortable. And so there were certain things where, for instance, Alec would come up with an idea for a card, and I'd go,
Do you have any examples of that? Because that's something I've heard you say before, and I've always kind of wondered.
it's very hard to think of things off the top of my
Well,
head.
you
but
probably ended up implementing them, so it probably started as a "oh, that's too hard" and became a
yeah, one example is probably something like, what if more than one character could exist on the same spot?
okay.
So the
Yeah.
way the game works is that there's a grid effectively of 2 by 3 positions on each side for the player and the opponent. And for various reasons, it was like, oh, what if two things could coexist on the same tile? And it was like, no, that's just how our game works. That's one of the rules. Which actually, whilst it was a constraint, I do think in terms of design philosophy, there's something to having constraints on your design
Yeah.
space, which yields interesting design. But part of that philosophy is that when you're looking to adjust your game in terms of either adding new content or finding more interesting ways of creating content, something you can look at is subverting, mutating the established rule set of the
Yeah.
game. And so for one of the DLCs, the most recent one, it's called Iris, the character, she can summon spirits and they can coexist on the same tile. And initially, that was a lot of work to make that happen because that was an established thing in the game. Not only that's how the
multiple
code worked,
DLCs.
but that was an assumption. So
Right.
every card in the game would assume that there was only one thing on a
Yeah.
tile. So suddenly, not only are you going, okay, I need to adjust the system to make spirits work, but you need to go, oh, is this going to break all of the established content of the
Yeah.
game? So that's maybe one example of that.
I think that's quite a common anxiety as you're designing a game, in that you want your feature set to interact, and so you make it interact, and you say that's a positive, and it does make your game better. But as soon as you have an agreed contract between two systems, or two entities, or two assets, whatever that thing is, breaking that contract by changing the relationship between those things is usually a problem.
And crucially, often it's an implicit contract. It's not something you've made explicit.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
something that's occurred throughout the development that you don't realize you've got assumptions baked into the design of your game.
Yeah, and it probably can throw things off in ways that you wouldn't naturally predict, and you suddenly realize you're getting this emergent behavior. If you're really lucky, it might be for the better.
Yes, and you go, oh, that's a new idea we can
Yeah.
exploit. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. So the evolution of having two units on one spot changes quite a lot about the underlying data. Did you find that you were fortunate that the approach you had initially taken allowed for it, or was it quite a major redesign?
It was a bit of both in the sense that the way spirits end up working it's not a true kind of reflection of there's two things there. It's more like the game is aware a character can be there and then a spirit can be there.
And it's associated with that character, or
It, when a spirit exists on the same tile as a character, it does become associated with it. But it's more that the tile has an awareness that these two explicit things can
okay.
live on it, rather than an arbitrary set
Yeah.
of things.
And then each time some operation happens on that place, on that square, you go through the code base and go, well, if you were doing this, this is what happens to the unit, and this is what happens to the spirit.
Yeah, because I
Right.
think a very natural approach you can take as a programmer, especially as you garner a bit of experience, is that you're presented with the problem of, our game doesn't support multiple things on a tile, now it needs to. Your initial place to leap to is, oh, well, it needs to support an arbitrary number of things
Sure.
on there. And I quickly realized that's not the correct approach because, one, this game is already shipped and we're on our final DLC. This is the last time I'm going to need to consider this problem. And it would be tremendously harder to deal with the abstract problem of what if it's an arbitrary number of arbitrary things. Because the game has characters, it has obstacles, so there's like barricades that the beavers can build. There can be traps put on tiles and things like that. I could have designed it to be a general purpose, multiple entity thing.
Yeah.
But it's just generally much easier to, in terms of cognitive load, to deal with something if it's, oh no, there can be a character and what we'll call a targetable behavior, which includes characters, obstacles, and that kind of thing. But it can also have a spirit as an additional thing. So it was easier to reason about.
I suppose that sort of speaks to the idea. It's certainly a trap. I don't know if I call it a trap in my case, but I fall into, which is there's a difference between designing a game and designing a system.
Yeah.
And somebody could come and say, wouldn't it be great if your game could do this? And what they really mean is your system could do this. And what they're really doing is generalizing your game and saying, your game loses its heart and its core. And I suppose in that sense, the game is built out of its constraints. What makes your game interesting is the rule set that you've defined. And if
Yes.
you break or bend that rule set too far, it might not be for the better of the result.
Yeah, I very strongly believe that the most interesting design in your game lives in the awkward edge case overlaps of
Mm,
mechanics. So as soon as you take that and then you move from an explicit system to something which needs to be generalized, you round off all the corners and you lose a lot of the interest. So it's very easy to be like, well, if we make one small change, it could suddenly become general purpose, but it means we have to tweak the design of this card just a little bit. It could be that tiny tweak takes the card from being really interesting to just really boring
yeah.
or kind of useless.
And you would run into these cases where you think, well, it's a cool idea, but we can't do that because
Which
X,
happened a
Y,
lot.
Z,
Yeah.
and you're sort of paying a price for this thing that past you made a decision, and it's now biting you every time you try and think of something new. What was interesting about what you said about that, you think you were talking about how you constrain certain things about the game and how that can lead to interesting areas in the game design. I kind of imagine it as almost like, you're inflating a balloon, but you're pinning it on certain corners, so then it inflates only into the areas that you haven't got the pins. It's kind of, if these are the fixed points, where are the sliders? What are we allowing ourselves to change? Do you feel like you kind of formalize that and went in the beginning, it would have been you can deal damage, you can draw, and you can discard. But down the line, you're talking about higher level kind of meta concepts of like, well, conceptually, cards are allowed to interface with characters and they're not allowed to interface with the environment. For example, do you feel like you ever kind of constrain that deliberately?
Yeah. It took me a while to appreciate it, but now I kind of see game design is less about like inventing an idea and forcing it into your game and more about observing your game as a this is going to sound pretentious, but it's more like it's a kind of growing organism and you
Right.
have to see how it wants to develop.
Yeah.
So rather than being like our game needs this system and you force it down on it, you kind of notice that okay, now this is the established sort of design space for the game, the rule set. It feels like if we augment this part or we transform that part or we limit you under certain circumstances in this other part, that's where the interesting stuff happens. So I see games more now as like a toy universe with their own rules, and it's about finding the interesting things that are possible in that universe than
Yeah.
thinking about what's an interesting idea that I can push into that universe.
And I suppose that natural evolution, it works very well because you're not just gluing together unrelated things and calling it a game. You're
Yeah.
starting in one place
And
and this
my
is core
soapbox
pillar.
comment would be that I think a lot of what we call game design now is that. So it's
Right.
thinking about our game needs a crafting system, it needs a weapon system, and these kind of Duplo level predefined concepts that you stick together to compose a game, rather than you need a germinating part to start from. So you need some concept of what the game is going to be to even kind of grow the universe to begin with. But it's much more about observing what are the unique properties of the game that we can exploit, rather than like gluing these established things
So
together.
it's sort of nurture. You,
Yeah,
you need to nurture the game more than stick things
it
to it.
sounds weird and kind of,
It
as
makes
I
it
said,
sound almost
pretentious.
alive.
But yeah, it really, I think until you've experienced it and noticed it and observed it in your own process, and this could be something where long form projects are advantageous because there's a lot of recommendations in particularly like the kind of indie scene for people to work on small projects that they can ship in a month, like you like fail fast, create things quickly. There's a lot of truth in that, but one of the things is that it's hard to articulate the benefits of like deep design and deep thought whilst working on a long project, and that could be one of them.
Well, I feel like it's often, certainly the game jam approach becomes a how fast can I implement a feature? And if we have multiple people in the team, we each do a feature, and our game is the sum of those features. And that
Yes.
process is often touted as being like a mini version of the wider game development process. And perhaps what we're alluding to here is that it isn't actually a small version of the bigger process. It's just a different way to do it, and
Yeah.
possibly not a optimal way to do it.
It's something like if you were a visual artist and all you ever did was produce sketches, you never produced a final rendered work or something, or you're a sculptor and you wanted to produce sketches of what you're going to sculpt. It's a different thing to produce quick drafts of an idea than something fully explored, fully fleshed out. So there's this idea I've come across in game design, particularly from people like John Blow, possibly the only person I've heard mention it, along with Mark Tenbosch. I think they have a talk from, it might be called Indiecade, called Experimental Gameplay. There's this idea of completeness, which is that you've established a rule set in your game implicitly, maybe not even consciously, but the game should fully explore every version of those mechanics, every inversion of certain things, so that the game won't feel like it was missing something if you fully
Mm.
explored that territory. Um, yeah,
Where does that process begin? Because you can't nurture something until it's there.
yeah,
So if you take the example of like Minecraft, you implement a voxel world, you decide that you want to make an open world adventure game, and you stick a character in the middle, you make it so they can walk. Now you, I imagine, feel like there's a grab bag of features in front of you. We can have breaking blocks, or we can have hunger, or we can, oh, we think crafting's good, we can have crafting. So I'm stood in an open world, I'm doing nothing. Or do you think the starting point is a bit further along? You need a core of a game before it can grow.
I think you have to. So when I said, you need to kind of nurture the thing. In order for the thing to exist, there has to be some initial vision for it. So
Right.
with Minecraft, I'm guessing it was like, what if you could mine blocks and you could craft new pickaxes to mine blocks? It doesn't have to be a well thought out starting point. It just needs to be something that establishes the kind of core essence of the game. But you need to be very willing to see that completely change if you feel the pull of the game in a different direction. So yeah, Minecraft's maybe a hard example to sort of think around, but it could be that initially the idea there was, oh, what if there was rails and minecarts, and like it was a game about growing the biggest minecart thing, and then you notice, oh, that actually could be really interesting, but perhaps it was like, oh, that's not very interesting. The fun part is doing the mining, and then it sort of pulls you in that direction.
And then I wonder if it's kind of the emotional response. You play test and you play it and you say, well, I'm really liking the core, but I feel it maybe a lack of danger, or maybe I feel like maybe you like that about the game and you're like, how else can we explore the space and it be calm and peaceful? And then you kind of pick things that suit the needs that you're finding, but you
Yeah.
didn't come at it and go, this game's going to have bad guys. You simply were in a peaceful world and thought, there should be some risk here.
Yeah, there's
How
a lack
can
of
we
pressure.
Yeah, and maybe that you start with the kind of lowest hanging fruit. So the minimal amount of change you have to make to solve that need and see how well that fits. So in Minecraft, that might just be full damage,
Yeah, and I was going to say
and then
that.
it's lava, and then it's mobs.
Yeah.
But you kind of take those stepping stones and see if you feel like you're moving in a good direction, or whether you've taken it too far and lost the heart of the thing.
Yeah, an example with Minecraft. I'm sure this is not how this happened, but you could imagine if you'd already got the world system done and there was already lava and full damage, and then you decide, oh, we're going to add the first mob today, and let's say it was like a little bull or something, and the bull could push you around if it hit you. You've now got an emergent property in your game where if the bull pushes you off a ledge, it could push you into lava, which is effectively an aggressive mob at that point. So you have to be kind of open to spotting the interactions you didn't expect when
Yeah.
adding features, and then going, that's what I mean by observing a quality of the universe of the game and going, that's a feature, like we want to capitalize
And it's
on.
it's almost more interesting the other way around, is that you did the mob and he was pushing you and you thought you were adding lava because people might fall into it, and then you implemented and realized you can be pushed in.
Yes, yeah.
And it's interesting as well because it's such a tiny example and yet very obviously easy to understand. And then you imagine a game that has infinitely more content, more features, more this. The combinational explosion. Is that the right word?
Combinatorial.
Combinatorial. Yeah, it didn't feel right. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's to an exponent, right? It just goes up. I mean, it's interesting that how you mentioned that you can't test for every edge case. There is this concept in code of unit testing, and lots of games do user testing. So they have people playing the game.
Yeah.
Some people have code playing the game. You can brute force it by running random scenarios and seeing, but obviously you need an idea of, has this gone wrong? And that's a hard thing to explain to a computer. How did you deal with that? How did you deal with that? There must have been many examples of things that you hadn't tested for and you were just confident they would work.
There's what happened, and then there's what I would do. So
okay, let's start with what happened.
What happened is I tried to write a system. One of the benefits of constraining a system is not just that constraints can make for interesting design, but it also constrains the number of things that can happen. So that also constrains the number of things that can go wrong in some sense. So there are very explicit things in the systems which mean certain things are just off the table from the get-go. So
Have you got any examples?
a card can't be played twice.
Okay.
Is one thing that's kind of a flaw in the
And
game.
did that survive the entire design process?
It very nearly didn't, but it has,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
because of other things in banners that kind of rely on that. It was too much work. So it is something I would change if I made a sequel. Um, where was I going with that? Was it?
That's how you did do it, is that you made that
Yes.
rule. But
So I had some level of confidence that because the system was constrained, certain things were off the table. That wasn't going to cause issues. Did a lot of user testing. We released as an early access game, so there was lots of player testing as well. There is a level of kind of uh, let's say code testing where there's like some scripts I'd run which would check for certain flaws. The way I would do it is because we're such a I'm going to get it wrong now, combinatorially explosive game, we can't do lots of unit testing because I also think unit testing is not a great idea generally. To quickly move on to that, it's mostly because a unit test is only as good as the test you've written. And so I'd have to write hundreds of tests which test individual
and every new
qualities.
one would require yet more tests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way I've seen it approached by other people that I would probably adopt is called fuzz testing, which is just you have part of the program select random things that are possible and
That's
then
what I would
have
have
them do it.
expected,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then you run it overnight, 24 hours or whatever, and just see what.
And that is
errors come up.
essentially a brute force method of
Yeah.
we're going to get reasonable coverage by just randomly testing everything.
Yeah, and you test for part of the problem with testing and unit testing is that you're testing for problems you're kind of predicting ahead of time when a lot of the weird problems are going to be things that you're just not conceiving of.
Yes.
And fuzz testing, so long as the random thing happened, will cover that because it's testing for any combination of events,
including nonsense. Because
yes,
if you were testing your own game, you would broadly, even if you were testing a particular thing, you would have some level of common sense. And what can be interesting for players is to do nonsense, do things that don't make sense, to see where they go. And you would probably find in a lot of game, deck builders being an example, that the thing that sounds like a ridiculous idea in a very specific context can actually be a very good strategy. And that's how ideas get born. And that's half the fun of it. We're looking for that. We're like adventurers.
Particularly, there's this phrase that sort of gets touted that the player wants to feel like they're cheating the game or doing something that the developer didn't expect you to do. And we're fine with that so long as there was sufficient work to get to that point. If it was, oh, I've worked out a way with the starting deck that I can just win, that would be one thing. But when it's, if I get these 5 cards, I can do something a bit wild. That's cool because you want the player to feel powerful and like surprised. Yeah.
I mean, so Balatro, which is Talk of the Town indie game right now, does exactly that, where once you reach a sufficiently high score, and it's like E to the 40, 50, something like that, maybe a bit more, it goes to Nan.
Oh.
And it says, Nan Infinity, which A, makes people feel a bit clever because it's a bit of a developer term.
Yeah.
But B, it does break the game, as in the graphics break. Whether that's a deliberate thing or a not deliberate thing, it's not long-term damage. It's just in that moment that score system looks weird and wrong and broken. It could be a feature with the art style that they've got.
I haven't played Blatra, so I don't have that contextual information. But
it's a good example of like, that's the threshold. We broke the game, guys, and no one's ever done that and been sad about it.
Yeah,
It's a hugely high score. But yeah, it's that idea that you kind of allow players to break it, but like you say, sufficient work has to go into it that it feels earned and feels broadly like a positive thing. They're cheating the game and winning at the game rather than cheating at the game and it crashes.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, really interesting. I don't want to go on for too long, so I think it would be a really good time to wrap up. That was a really interesting conversation. Always love talking about game design with you, and I'm sure we will talk again about other things.
Yeah.
So thank you for being on Lost Pixels. Can you tell people where they can find you if they're interested in hearing more?
Yes, I'm Callum Tweedie-Walker. I'm only really active on Twitter, and that's at Callum TW. I founded Monte Bearo, which is at Monte Monte Bearo Bearo with Alec Thomas, who's Alec G Thomas on Twitter, and you can get Banners of Ruin on Steam, on Epic, on Switch, and GOG.
Lovely. Thanks for coming.
No problem.